Fairer than a fairy from the Yellow Fairy book. Once there lived a king who had no children for many years after his marriage. At length, heaven granted him a daughter of such remarkable beauty that he could think of no name so appropriate for her as Fairer than a Fairy. It never occurred to him, such a good-natured monarch, that such a name was certain to call down the hatred and jealousy of the fairies in the body on his child. But that's what happened. No sooner had they heard of this presumptuous name than they resolved to gain possession of her who bore it, and either to torment her cruelly, or at least conceal her from the eyes of all men. The eldest of their tribe was entrusted to carry out their revenge. This fairy was named Lagree. She was so old that she only had one eye and one tooth left, and even these poor remains she had to keep all night in a strengthening liquid. She was also so spiteful that she gladly devoted all her time to carrying out all the mean or ill-natured tricks of the whole body of the fairies. With her large expertise, added to her native spite, she found but little difficulty in carrying off Fairer than a Fairy. The poor child, who was only 7 years old, nearly died of fear on finding herself in the power of this hideous creature. However, when after an hour's journey underground she found herself in a splendid palace with lovely gardens, she felt a little reassured, and felt rather cheered when she discovered that her pet cat and dog had followed her. The old fairy led her to a pretty room, which she said should be hers, at the same time giving her the strictest orders never to let out the fire, which was burning brightly in the grate. She then gave 2 glass bottles into the princess's charge, desiring her to take the greatest care of them, and having enforced her orders with the most awful threats in case of disobedience, she vanished, leaving the little girl at liberty to explore the palace and the grounds, and a good deal relieved at only 2 apparent easy tasks. Several years passed, during which one day, whilst passing near a fountain in the garden, she noticed that the sun's rays fell on the water in such a manner as to produce a brilliant rainbow. She stood still to admire it, when, to her great surprise, she heard a voice addressing her which seemed to come from the center of its rays. The voice was that of a young man, and its sweetness of tone and the agreeable things it uttered led one to infer that its owner must be equally charming. But this had to be a mere matter of fancy, for no one was visible. The beautiful rainbow informed Fairer than a Fairy that he was young, the son of a powerful king, and that the fairy Lagree, who owned his parents, had a grudge, and had revenged herself by depriving him of his natural shape for some years. She had then imprisoned him in the palace, where he had found his confinement hard to bear for some time. But now, he owned, he no longer sighed for freedom, since he had been seen and learned to love Fairer than a Fairy. He added many other tender speeches to this declaration, and the princess, to whom such remarks were a new experience, could not help feeling pleased and touched by his attentions. The prince could only appear or speak under the form of a rainbow, and it was therefore necessary that the sun should shine on the water so as to enable the rays to form themselves. Fairer than a Fairy lost no moment in which she could meet her lover, and they enjoyed many long and interesting interviews. One day, however, their conversation became so absorbing, and time passed so quickly, that the princess forgot to attend the fire, and it went out. Legree, on her return, soon found out the neglect, and seemed only too pleased to have the opportunity of showing her spite to the lovely princess. She ordered Fairer than a Fairy to start next day at dawn, and ask Lucrinus for fire, with which to relight the one she had allowed to go out. Now, this Lucrinus was a cruel monster who devoured everyone he came across, and especially enjoyed the chance of catching and eating any young girls. They're tasty. Our heroine obeyed with great sweetness, and without having been able to leave her lover, she set off to go to Lucrinus as to certain death. As she was crossing the wood, a bird sang to her to pick up a shining pebble, which she could find in the fountain close by, and to use it when needed. She took the bird's advice, and in due time arrived at the house of Lucrinus. Luckily, she only found his wife at home, who was much struck by the princess's youth and beauty, and her sweet, gentle manners, and still further impressed by the presence of the shining pebble. She readily let Fairer than Fair have fire, and in return she gave her the stone. She gave her another, which she said might prove useful some day. Then she sent her away without doing her any harm. Legree was much surprised as displeased at the happy result of the expedition, and Fairer than a Fairy waited anxiously for an opportunity of meeting Prince Rainbow and telling him of her adventures. She found, however, that he had already been told all about them by a fairy who protected him, and to whom he was related. The dread of fresh dangers to his beloved princess made him devise some more convenient way of meeting than the garden fountain, and Fairer than a Fairy carried out his plan daily with entire success. Every morning she placed a large basin full of water on her window sill, and as soon as the sun's rays fell on the water, the rainbow appeared as clearly as it had done by the fountain. By this means they were able to meet without losing sight of the fire or the two bottles in which the old fairy kept her eyes and her tooth at night. And for some time the lovers enjoyed every hour of sunshine together. One day the Prince Rainbow appeared in the depths of woe. He had just heard that he was to be banished from this lovely spot, but he had no idea where he was to go. The poor young couple were in despair, and only parted with the last rays of sunshine, and in hopes of meeting next morning. Alas, the sun broke through the clouds for a few moments, but it was still dark and gloomy. Fairer than a Fairy eagerly ran to the window, but in her haste she upset the basin, and spilt all the water which she had carefully filled it overnight. No other water was at hand except that in the two bottles. It was the only chance of seeing her lover before they were separated, so she did not hesitate to break the bottle and pour the contents into the basin. when the rainbow appeared at once. Their farewells were full of tenderness. The prince made the most ardent and sincere protestations, and promised to neglect nothing which might help to deliver his dear Fairer than a Fairy from her captivity, and implored her to consent to their marriage as soon as they should both be free. The princess, on the other side, vowed to have no other husband, and declared herself willing to brave death itself in order to rejoin him. They were not allowed much time for their adieus. The rainbow vanished, and the princess, resolved to run all risks, started off at once, taking nothing with her but her dog and cat, a sprig of myrtle, and the stone which the wife of Locrinos had given her. Then Legree became aware of her prisoner's flight, and she was furious, and set off at full speed in pursuit. She overtook her just as the poor girl, overcome by fatigue, had lain down to rest in a cave, which the stone had formed itself into a shelter for her. The little dog who was watching her mistress promptly flew at Legree and bit her so severely that she stumbled against the corner of the cave and broke off her only tooth. Before she had recovered from the pain and rage this caused her, the princess had time to escape and was some way on her road. Fear gave her strength for some time, but at last she could go no further and sank down to rest. As she did so, the sprig of myrtle she carried touched the ground, and immediately a green and shady bower sprang up round her, in which she hoped to sleep in peace. But Legree had not given up her pursuit, and arrived just as Fairer than Fairy had fallen fast asleep. This time she made sure of catching her victim, but the cat spied her out, and springing from the bough of the arbor, she flew at Legree's face and tore out her only eye, thus delivering the princess forever from her persecutor. One might have thought this would all be well now, but no sooner had Legree been put to the fight than our heroine was overwhelmed with hunger and thirst. She felt as though she would certainly expire, and it was with some difficulty that she dragged herself as far as a pretty little green and white house, which stood at no great distance. Here she was received by a beautiful lady dressed in green and white to match the house, which apparently belonged to her, and which she seemed the only inhabitant. Greeting the fainting princess most kindly, she gave her an excellent supper, and after a long night's rest in a delightful bed, told her that after many troubles she should finally attain her desire. As the green and white lady took leave of the princess, she gave her a nut, desiring her only to open it in the most urgent need. After a long and tiring journey, Fairer than a Fairy was once more received in a house by a lady exactly like the one she had quitted. Here again she received a present with the same injunctions, but instead of a nut, the lady gave her a golden pomegranate. The mournful princess had to continue her weary way, and after many troubles and hardships, she again found rest and shelter in a third house, exactly similar to the other two. These houses belonged to the three sisters, all endowed with fairy gifts, and all so alike in mind and person that they wished their houses and garments to be equally alike. Their occupation consisted in helping those in misfortune, and they were as gentle and benevolent as Legree had been cruel and spiteful. The third fairy comforted the poor traveler, begged her not to lose heart, and assured her that her troubles should be rewarded. She accompanied her advice with a gift of a crystal smelling bottle, with strict orders only to open it in case of urgent need. Fairer than a Fairy thanked her warmly and resumed her way, cheered by pleasant thoughts. After a time, her road led through a wood full of soft airs and sweet odors, and before she had gone 100 yards, she saw a wonderful silver castle suspended by strong silver chains to four of the largest trees. It was so perfectly hung that a gentle breeze rocked it sufficiently to send you pleasantly to sleep. Fairer than a Fairy felt a strong desire to enter the castle, but besides being hung a little above ground, there seemed to be neither doors nor windows, and she had no doubt, though really I cannot think why, that eh, that the moment had come in which to use the nut which he had given to her. She opened it, and out came a diminutive hall porter, at whose bell rung a tiny chain, and at the end was a golden half-key as long as the smallest pin you ever saw. The princess climbed up one of the silver chains, holding in her hand the little porter, who, in spite of his minute size, opened a secret door with his golden key and let her in. She entered a magnificent room which appeared to occupy the entire castle, and which was lighted by gold and jeweled stars in the ceiling. In the midst of this room stood a couch, draped with curtains of all the colors of the rainbow, and suspended by golden cords so that it swayed with the castle in the manner which it rocked its occupants delightfully to sleep. On this elegant couch lay Prince Rainbow, looking more beautiful than ever, and sunk in the profound slumber in which he had been ever since his disappearance. Fairer than a Fairy, who now saw him for the first time in his real shape, hardly dared to gaze at him, fearing lest his appearance might not be in keeping with the voice and language which had won her heart. At the same time, she could not help feeling rather hurt at the apparent indifference with which she was received. She related all the dangers and difficulties she had gone through, and though she repeated the story 20 times in a loud, clear voice, the prince slept on and took no heed. Then she had recourse to the golden pomegranate, and opening it, found that all the seeds were as many little violins, which flew up in the vaulted roof, and at once began playing melodiously. The prince was not completely aroused, but he opened his eyes a little and looked all the handsomer. Impatient at not being recognized, Fairer than a Fairy now drew out the third present, and on opening the crystal scent bottle, a little siren flew out, who silenced the violins and then sang close to the prince's ear the story of all his lady love had endured in her search for him. She added some little reproaches to the tale, but before she had got far he was wide awake, and, transported with joy, threw himself at the princess's feet. At the same moment, the walls of the room expanded and opened out, revealing a gold throne covered in jewels. A magnificent court now began to assemble, and at the same time elegant carriages filled with ladies and magnificent coaches drove up. At the first, the most splendid of these carriages sat Prince Rainbow's mother. She fondly embraced her son, after which she informed him that his father had been dead for some years, that the anger of the fairies was at length appeased, and that he might return in peace to reign over his people, who were longing for his presence. The court received the new king with joyful acclamations, which would have delighted him at any other time. But all his thoughts were full of Fairer than a Fairy. He was just about to present her to his mother and the court, feeling that she could charm and win all their hearts, when the three green and white sisters appeared. They declared the secret of Fairer than a Fairy's royal birth, and the queen, taking the two lovers in her carriage, set off with them to the capital of the kingdom. Here they were received with tumultuous joy. The wedding was celebrated without delay, and succeeding years diminished neither the virtues or beauty, nor the mutual affection of King Rainbow and his queen, Fairer than a Fairy.